In January of 1893, American Marines marched into Honolulu and helped overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii. The monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, surrendered her throne under armed pressure. Within weeks, a provisional government controlled by American sugar planters requested annexation by the United States. 2 months later, the newly inaugurated President Grover Cleveland withdrew the annexation treaty, condemned the overthrow as illegal, and publicly called for the restoration of the Hawaiian monarchy. 5 years later, in 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii anyway. This is the story of how a sovereign kingdom, recognized by the world's major powers, was dismantled in 2 distinct acts, separated by half a decade. Not a sudden conquest, but a slow-motion collapse of independence caused by economic dependency, political paralysis, and a war fought thousands of miles away. The Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1880s was a constitutional monarchy with treaties binding it to the United States, Britain, France, and Japan. It had embassies, a legal system, and a native population that had governed these islands for centuries. But it also had something that made it vulnerable, an economy almost entirely dependent on a single crop sold to a single customer. Sugar. By the mid-1880s, sugar plantations dominated the Hawaiian economy. The plantations were not owned by native Hawaiians. They were owned by American businessmen who had arrived decades earlier, bought land, and built an agricultural system that relied on contract laborers imported from Asia. The sugar went to the United States, and the profit returned to the plantation owners. In 1876, the Kingdom of Hawaii and the United States signed a treaty of reciprocity. Hawaiian sugar could enter American markets duty-free. In exchange, Hawaii granted the U.S. exclusive use of Pearl Harbor as a naval coaling station. The treaty tied Hawaii's economy directly to American trade policy. If that policy changed, the plantations would lose their competitive edge, and the men who owned those plantations would lose money. In 1887, those men decided they needed more control. King Kalakua, the reigning monarch, had been attempting to restore some of the crown's traditional authority and to protect the political rights of native Hawaiians, who were steadily losing influence as the plantation economy grew. A group of American and European businessmen, organized into a secret society called the Hawaiian League, forced the king to sign a new constitution at gunpoint. It became known as the Bayonet Constitution. This document stripped the monarchy of most of its executive power, transferred authority to a cabinet controlled by the legislature, and imposed strict property and income requirements for voting. The result was that wealthy foreign residents could vote, while most native Hawaiians could not. The Constitution also allowed non-citizens to vote if they met the property threshold. In a single stroke, political power shifted from the indigenous population to the planter class. Kalakaua ruled under these constraints until his death in 1891. His sister, Liliuokalani, became queen. She inherited a government she could not fully control and a legislature dominated by men whose economic interests conflicted with the welfare of her people. Then, in 1890, the United States passed the McKinley Tariff. This law removed the Hawaiian sugar advantage by offering subsidies to domestic American sugar producers. Suddenly, Hawaiian sugar had to compete on equal terms with sugar grown in Louisiana and other states. The plantations faced a crisis. The only way to restore their preferential access to American markets was to make Hawaii part of the United States. Annexation became the goal. Queen Liliuokalani understood what was happening. In January of 1893, she announced her intention to promulgate a new constitution that would restore voting rights to native Hawaiians and return power to the monarchy. It was a direct challenge to the Bayonet Constitution and to the men who benefited from it. The response was immediate. On January 16th, a group of businessmen calling themselves the Committee of Safety held a meeting. They decided to overthrow the monarchy. The committee was led by Sanford Dole, a Honolulu-born son of American missionaries, and Lauren Thurston, a lawyer whose family had deep ties to the plantation economy. They did not have an army. They did not need one. They had something more useful: the support of John L. Stevens, the United States Minister to Hawaii. Stevens was not a neutral diplomat. He believed Hawaii should be annexed by the United States, and he was willing to act on that belief. On January 16th, he sent a request to the USS Boston, a warship anchored in Honolulu Harbor, asking for Marines to be landed to protect American lives and property. The request was approved. 160 Marines came ashore. They did not march to the American consulate or to any area where American civilians were gathered. They marched to a building directly across from Iolani Palace, the seat of the Hawaiian government, and set up positions with artillery pieces aimed at the palace. The message was clear. The next day, January 17th, the Committee of Safety gathered at a government building and read a proclamation. The Hawaiian monarchy was abolished. A provisional government was now in charge. Sanford Dole was president. The new government requested immediate annexation by the United States. Queen Liliuokalani faced a choice. She could resist and risk bloodshed, knowing that American Marines were positioned to support the provisional government. Or she could surrender and trust that the United States government, once informed of what had happened, would investigate and restore her throne. She chose surrender. In her written statement, she made clear that she was yielding to the superior force of the United States, not to the provisional government. She believed the American government would correct the situation. She was wrong. Within weeks, the provisional government sent a delegation to Washington to negotiate a treaty of annexation. President Benjamin Harrison, in the final days of his administration, signed the treaty and submitted it to the Senate for ratification. It looked as though annexation would proceed quickly. Then Grover Cleveland took office. Cleveland was skeptical of the annexation from the start. He withdrew the treaty and sent a representative, James Blount, to Hawaii to investigate what had actually happened. Blount spent 4 months interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, and observing the political situation. His report, delivered in July of 1893, was unambiguous. The overthrow had been illegal. Minister Stevens had conspired with the Committee of Safety. The Marines had been landed not to protect American lives, but to intimidate the Hawaiian government. The provisional government had no popular support among native Hawaiians and existed only because of American military presence. Cleveland agreed. In December of 1893, he delivered a message to Congress condemning the overthrow and calling for the restoration of Queen Liliuokalani. But he did not send troops to enforce that restoration. The provisional government in Honolulu refused to step down. Sanford Dole, now leading the government that had overthrown the Queen, sent his own message to Washington. He argued that the kingdom was gone, that the provisional government controlled all administrative functions, and that restoring the monarchy would require invading Hawaii and removing American citizens from power by force. Cleveland faced a choice. He could order the Navy to reverse what the Navy had enabled. He could use American troops to restore the Queen that American troops had helped depose. But that would mean deploying military force against American settlers, men who controlled the sugar plantations, the docks, the banks, men who had allies in Congress. Cleveland chose condemnation without action. He withdrew the annexation treaty. He published the Blount Report. He made clear that the United States government officially disapproved of what had happened, but he would not use force to undo it. The provisional government remained in power. The Queen, meanwhile, waited. She had surrendered her authority under protest, with the expectation that the United States would investigate and correct the wrong. The investigation had happened. The wrong had been acknowledged, but correction did not follow. She submitted formal protests to the State Department. She wrote letters to President Cleveland. She appealed to international law, to treaty obligations, to the principle that sovereign nations could not simply be erased by a handful of foreign nationals, backed by foreign troops. Her protests were received. They were filed. Nothing changed. By mid-1894, it became clear that Cleveland would not act and that the provisional government would not surrender. The Committee of Safety moved to formalize their position. On July 4th, they declared the establishment of the Republic of Hawaii. Sanford Dole became president. They drafted a constitution. They created a legislature. They issued currency. They behaved, in every administrative sense, as if they were a legitimate independent nation. They were not independent. They had no intention of remaining independent. The Republic was a placeholder, a structure designed to hold power until annexation became politically possible in Washington. But the appearance of sovereignty gave them a stronger position. They were no longer a provisional rebel government. They were, on paper, a republic with a constitution and a president. Liliuokalani did not accept this. In January of 1895, a group of native Hawaiians and royalist supporters attempted a counter-coup. They gathered weapons, planned to seize key buildings, and hoped to restore the monarchy by force. The plot was poorly organized. The Republic's forces discovered it quickly, arrested the conspirators, and crushed the uprising within days. The Republic used the failed rebellion as justification to arrest the Queen herself. They claimed she had prior knowledge of the plot. They searched her home, found weapons and correspondence, and charged her with treason against the Republic of Hawaii. She was imprisoned in an upstairs room of Iolani Palace, the same building where she had once ruled as queen. In exchange for the release of the imprisoned royalists, Liliuokalani signed a document of abdication. She formally gave up any claim to the throne. She swore allegiance to the Republic of Hawaii. She did so under house arrest, with her supporters facing execution if she refused. After 8 months of confinement, she was released but remained under restrictions. She would never govern again. The Republic had neutralized the Queen. They had crushed armed resistance. They controlled the islands without meaningful internal opposition, but they still did not have what they wanted. The United States still had not annexed them. President Cleveland's term ended in March of 1897. William McKinley, a Republican with expansionist sympathies, took office. The Republic saw an opening. Within months, they sent another delegation to Washington with a new annexation treaty. McKinley supported it. He submitted the treaty to the Senate in June of 1897. A treaty required a 2/3 vote in the Senate. That was a high threshold. Opposition came from multiple directions. Some senators objected on constitutional grounds, arguing that annexing a sovereign nation without the consent of its people violated international law. Others worried about absorbing a non-white population into the United States. Still others represented sugar-producing states and did not want Hawaiian competition. The treaty stalled. For a year, the annexation proposal sat in the Senate without enough votes. The Republic of Hawaii continued to function as a nominally independent state. The Queen, now a private citizen with no official power, continued to protest. She traveled to Washington in 1897 and submitted a petition opposing annexation, signed by thousands of native Hawaiians. The petition argued that the overthrow had been illegal, that the Republic did not represent the will of the Hawaiian people, and that the United States had a moral obligation to restore the kingdom rather than annex it. The petition was received. It did not change the political calculation, but it did reveal the votes. When McKinley counted support in the Senate, he could not reach 67 votes. Annexation, again, seemed blocked. Then the situation in the Pacific changed. In April of 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The conflict was fought on 2 fronts: Cuba in the Caribbean and the Philippines in the Western Pacific. The Navy's Asiatic Squadron, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, sailed from Hong Kong toward Manila Bay to engage the Spanish fleet. The distance from the west coast of the United States to the Philippines is over 7,000 miles. Warships running on coal needed to refuel. They needed a coaling station, a base in the middle of the Pacific where supply ships could meet the fleet. Dewey's ships stopped in Honolulu before continuing west. The strategic value of Hawaii, long argued in theory by annexationists, became immediate and material. Suddenly, annexation was not only about sugar tariffs and political ideology. It was about military necessity. If the United States did not control Hawaii, another power could. If Japan or Germany established influence there, American naval operations in the Pacific would be severely constrained. The islands sat directly on the supply line between California and Asia. Losing access to them, or sharing access with a rival, was now unacceptable. The war provided the justification that political maneuvering alone could not. Senators who had opposed annexation on principle found themselves facing a different question. It was no longer whether annexation was morally right. It was whether the United States could afford not to control Hawaii during a Pacific War. McKinley and his allies in Congress saw the opening. They knew the treaty still lacked votes, so they shifted tactics. Instead of pursuing a treaty, which required 2/3 of the Senate, they introduced a joint resolution. A joint resolution was a legislative act, not a treaty. It required only a simple majority in both the House and the Senate. The Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress the power to annex territory by resolution, but there was no explicit prohibition either. The legal ground was uncertain, but the political path was clear. The resolution was called the Newlands Resolution, named after Congressman Francis Newlands of Nevada, who introduced it. The text was straightforward. It declared that the Hawaiian Islands and their dependencies were annexed to the United States. It transferred sovereignty, ceded public lands to the federal government, and established that existing laws of Hawaii would remain in force until Congress legislated otherwise. It made no mention of the overthrow, the Queen, or the protests. It simply declared annexation accomplished. Debate in Congress was brief. Supporters argued military necessity and manifest destiny. Opponents argued constitutional overreach and the injustice of annexing a nation whose government had been installed by American force. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. On July 6, 1898, the House of Representatives passed the Newlands Resolution. On July 7th, the Senate followed. The margin was narrow but sufficient. President McKinley signed the resolution into law on July 7th. The Republic of Hawaii ceased to exist. The Hawaiian Islands became a territory of the United States. 5 years had passed since the overthrow. 5 years during which the Queen had protested, Cleveland had condemned, and the provisional government had refused to yield. 5 years during which 2 annexation treaties had failed. The mechanism that finally succeeded was not a treaty negotiated between sovereign powers. It was a legislative act passed during a war, justified by strategic necessity, requiring only a majority vote. Liliuokalani was 60 years old when annexation became final. She had been queen for less than 2 years. She had spent 5 years fighting to restore the kingdom. She would live for another 19 years as a citizen of the country that had taken her throne. She continued to protest, to file legal claims for compensation, to argue that the annexation was illegal under international law. She received a small pension from the territorial government. She never received an apology. She died in 1917. The Hawaiian Islands remained a United States territory for 61 years. In 1959, they became the 50th state. By then, Native Hawaiians were a minority in their own land, outnumbered by descendants of plantation workers and American settlers. In 1993, 100 years after the overthrow, Congress passed a resolution apologizing for the role of the United States in the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The resolution acknowledged that the Marines had been landed to intimidate the Hawaiian government, that Minister Stevens had conspired with the insurgents, and that Native Hawaiians had never relinquished their sovereignty. It expressed regret. It did not reverse the annexation. The overthrow took 1 day. The annexation took 5 years. The first required Marines and a proclamation. The second required a change in presidential administration, a failed treaty, a foreign war, and a legal workaround that bypassed constitutional requirements. The kingdom fell quickly. The justification for taking it permanently required patience, political maneuvering, and a conflict 7,000 miles away that made Hawaii too valuable to leave unclaimed. Liliuokalani lived another 24 years after annexation. She never returned to the throne. She lived in Washington Place, her private residence in Honolulu, and watched as the islands she had ruled were reshaped into an American territory. She composed music, wrote her memoirs, and pursued a quiet legal claim for compensation for lands seized from the crown. The United States government eventually paid her a small settlement. It was not restitution. It was a gesture. She died in 1917 during the First World War in a country that had erased the nation she represented. Her funeral was attended by thousands of native Hawaiians who still regarded her as their queen. The American territorial government lowered its flag to half-staff. It was an acknowledgement of her symbolic status, not her legal authority. The story of how Hawaii was annexed is often told as a simple tale of imperial ambition. A powerful nation wanted land, and it took it. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The full answer requires understanding why the overthrow in 1893 did not immediately lead to annexation, why a president who condemned the act did nothing to reverse it, and why the final transfer of sovereignty required a war that had nothing to do with Hawaii. The mechanism was not brute force alone. It was political patience, legal creativity, and the exploitation of a strategic moment. When Grover Cleveland withdrew the annexation treaty in March of 1893, he believed he was acting on principle. His investigator, James Blount, had confirmed that Minister Stevens had conspired with the insurgents, that the Marines had been used to intimidate the Hawaiian government, and that the overthrow would not have succeeded without American military support. Cleveland called the act an abuse of power. He asked Congress to restore the monarchy, but Congress did not act. The provisional government in Honolulu, now led by Sanford Dole, refused to step down. Cleveland faced a dilemma. He could order American forces to remove Dole and reinstall Liliuokalani, but that would require invading a government led by American citizens. It would provoke a domestic political crisis. Southern Democrats, still bitter over Reconstruction, opposed federal use of military force to impose political outcomes. Northern Republicans supported the annexationists and accused Cleveland of abandoning American interests. Cleveland chose inaction. He condemned the overthrow, but did not reverse it. The provisional government remained in power, unrecognized by the United States, but also unopposed. It was a strange kind of limbo. Hawaii was no longer a kingdom, but it was not yet a territory. It existed in a legal and diplomatic gap. In 1894, the provisional government formalized its position by declaring itself the Republic of Hawaii. It adopted a constitution, elected Sanford Dole as president, and presented itself as a legitimate independent nation. It was not independent in any meaningful sense. It had no international recognition beyond the United States, no military, and no economic base apart from the sugar plantations controlled by the same men who had overthrown the monarchy. But it had one critical asset. It controlled the government buildings, the police, and the legal apparatus of the islands. The new republic suppressed native Hawaiian political movements. It maintained the restrictive voting laws from the Bayonet Constitution, ensuring that power remained with the planter elite. When Royalists attempted an armed rebellion in 1895, the government crushed it and used the failed revolt as justification to arrest Liliuokalani. She was tried for treason, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. The sentence was commuted to house arrest after 8 months. The message was clear: the monarchy would not return. Cleveland left office in 1897. His successor, William McKinley, held a different view of American power. McKinley was an expansionist. He believed that the United States should acquire overseas territories to compete with European empires, secure markets for American goods, and establish naval bases across the Pacific. Hawaii to McKinley was not a problem to be managed. It was an opportunity. Within months of taking office, McKinley submitted a new treaty of annexation to the Senate. This time, the momentum seemed stronger. The Republic of Hawaii officially requested annexation. American business interests supported it. Naval strategists argued that Pearl Harbor, which the United States had gained access to under an earlier treaty, would be essential in any future conflict with Japan or European powers in Asia. But the treaty still faced opposition. Anti-imperialists in the Senate argued that annexation violated the principle of self-determination, that it was unconstitutional to acquire foreign territory without the consent of its people, and that incorporating a population of non-white natives would undermine American racial homogeneity. Southern senators, in particular, opposed bringing a multiracial territory into the Union. The treaty could not secure the two-thirds majority required for ratification. By early 1898, the treaty appeared stalled. McKinley wanted Hawaii, but he did not have the votes. The Republic of Hawaii remained nominally independent, waiting. Then the war came. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. The cause of the explosion was never conclusively determined, but American newspapers blamed Spain. Public outrage grew. In April, Congress declared war. The United States was now fighting a two-theater conflict, one in the Caribbean against Spanish forces in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and another in the Pacific against Spanish forces in the Philippines. The Pacific Campaign changed everything for Hawaii. To strike the Spanish fleet in Manila, the United States Navy had to cross 6,000 miles of ocean. Warships needed coal, water, and repairs. Hawaii was the only viable mid-Pacific base. Without it, the Navy could not sustain operations in the Philippines. Suddenly, the strategic value of the islands was undeniable. McKinley and his advisors moved quickly. They knew the treaty would still fail in the Senate, so they pursued a different mechanism, a joint resolution of Congress. Unlike a treaty, which required a two-thirds vote in the Senate, a joint resolution required only a simple majority in both houses. It was the same method that had been used to annex Texas in 1845. Opponents argued that a joint resolution was unconstitutional for annexing foreign territory. They pointed out that Hawaii was a sovereign nation, not a rebellious province like Texas. They argued that Congress could not acquire territory by simple majority vote, that such power belonged exclusively to the treaty process. Legal scholars were divided, but political momentum favored McKinley. In June of 1898, American forces captured Manila Bay. The victory demonstrated that the United States could project power across the Pacific, but it also made clear that holding the Philippines would require a permanent supply line. Hawaii was the linchpin. On June 15th, the House of Representatives passed the Newlands Resolution, named after Congressman Francis Newlands of Nevada, by a vote of 209 to 91. On July 6th, the Senate passed it by a vote of 42 to 21. On July 7th, McKinley signed it. The Republic of Hawaii ceased to exist. The Hawaiian Islands became a territory of the United States. The resolution did not address the legality of the original overthrow. It did not compensate the native Hawaiian population. It did not restore voting rights. It simply declared that Hawaii was now American. Sanford Dole, who had led the overthrow and governed the republic, was appointed the first territorial governor by McKinley. The annexation was complete. The interval between overthrow and annexation had lasted 5 years and 6 months. The delay was not accidental. It reflected the political reality that a significant portion of the American government opposed taking Hawaii. Cleveland's condemnation had not been symbolic. His refusal to act militarily had been a Hawaii's genuine constraint. The treaty process had failed twice. Only the outbreak of war provided the strategic justification strong enough to overcome domestic opposition and the legal workaround necessary to bypass constitutional barriers. The war ended in August. Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States. Cuba became a protectorate. The United States emerged as a Pacific power. Hawaii, which had been annexed in the middle of the conflict, became essential to administering the new empire. Pearl Harbor was developed into a major naval base. The islands were no longer a kingdom, no longer a republic, no longer a diplomatic problem. They were infrastructure. The native Hawaiian population, which had numbered over 300,000 before Western contact, had been reduced to under 40,000 by 1900. Disease, migration, and the collapse of traditional land systems had devastated the community. Under American territorial rule, political power remained concentrated with the planter elite and the military. Native Hawaiians had minimal representation in the territorial legislature. Statehood, when it came in 1959, did not restore indigenous sovereignty. It formalized the island's integration into the United States. The overthrow had been swift. The annexation required waiting for the right political moment. The first was an act of force disguised as protection. The second was an act of law disguised as necessity. Both were irreversible. 100 years later, the United States government apologized for the overthrow. It did not offer independence. It did not return the land. The apology acknowledged the crime but left the outcome unchanged. Liliuokalani's kingdom had been recognized by Britain, France, Germany, and Japan. It had treaties, ambassadors, and a postal system. It had a constitution and a legal code. It was a member of the community of nations. In one day, that status was taken. In 5 years, it was erased permanently. The difference between the two acts was not moral, it was procedural. The overthrow was illegal but effective.